In the autumn of 1844, workmen at the Kingoody quarry near Dundee, Scotland, split a block of sandstone cut from deep inside the working face, and the stone came apart to show something no one in that pit had ever pulled out of rock before. A nail sat lodged inside it, its head corroded flat, its shaft still holding the straight line of something forged rather than grown. The quarrymen had worked that bed for years without finding anything stranger than the usual fossil impressions, and this was different enough that word of it reached a man with the standing to make the discovery matter. Sir David Brewster, the Scottish physicist, already known across Europe for his work on the kaleidoscope and on the polarization of light, examined the stone himself and carried an account of it to that year's meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. He did not call it a fraud. He did not call it proof of anything grander either. He described what the quarrymen had shown him and what he had confirmed with his own hands, and he let the geologists in the room decide what to do with it. The bed that nail came out of was already understood, by the geology of 1844, to be old. Sandstone laid down in even, undisturbed layers long before anything resembling a forge existed anywhere on Earth to make a nail in the first place. That was the problem Brewster could not talk around, and it is the same problem that keeps the story alive nearly 2 centuries later, repeated by people who have never seen the block and can no longer see it, because the block itself did not survive. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The block itself, by every account passed down from that day, was unremarkable on the outside, grey sandstone quarried in slabs, meant for building stone rather than study, the kind of material Kingoody shipped out by the wagon load, without anyone examining a single piece closely. It was only the act of splitting it, driven by ordinary quarry work, rather than any search for something unusual, that exposed the nail at all. Had the block been sold whole, or split along a different line, whatever was inside it would have gone into a wall or a foundation somewhere in Dundee, unnoticed and unremarked on for as long as that building stood. What the quarrymen described, and what Brewster repeated to the association, was specific enough to matter to the geologists sitting in that room. The nail was not resting in a pocket or a crevice that might have let something recent slip down from the surface. It was set inside solid stone, with no crack or seam connecting its position to open air, at least according to the men who had split the block themselves and watched it come apart. A nail with a seam running to it could have fallen there any time in the last 100 years. A nail with no seam at all had to have gotten there some other way, and nobody in that room in 1844 had a way to explain what that other way might be. Sandstone forms the way most sedimentary rock forms, through layers of sediment pressed and cemented together over enormous stretches of time, and a nail inside undisturbed sandstone should mean the nail is at least as old as the rock around it. Iron nails, by any account of human history available in 1844 or available now, did not exist before human beings learned to smelt and forge metal, a technology the geology of the period placed at only a few thousand years back at the very most. The sandstone at Kingoody was not a few thousand years old, by any measurement available to the science of the day. That gap, between what the rock was supposed to be and what the rock apparently contained, is the entire reason this story outlived the men who first told it. By 1844, the outlines of that timescale were not obscure or fringe science. James Hutton had argued decades earlier that the layers beneath Scotland's own soil recorded a far longer history than a few thousand years could account for, and Charles Lyell's work on the subject was already reshaping how British geologists thought about the ground under their feet. Brewster was not a geologist by training, but the men he addressed at the association meeting were, and they were the ones best equipped in all of Britain to say whether a few thousand years could stretch far enough to cover both the sandstone and the nail. Nobody in that room offered a version of the timeline that made room for both. Brewster's report did what such reports usually did in that period. It was read, discussed, and set down in the published proceedings of the meeting, filed alongside papers the association considered more settled. The association in those years functioned as the closest thing Britain had to a single clearinghouse for new geological findings. drawing members from every regional society in the country to hear papers read aloud over the course of a week, and a report from a fellow with Brewster's reputation would have commanded more attention in that room than the same account delivered by an unknown quarry owner ever could have. Some of the geologists present offered the explanation that has followed the case ever since, that the quarrymen must have missed a fissure, that a nail could have worked its way into a crack too fine to notice once the surrounding stone had closed back over it during blasting, that a hoax by a workman looking to make his afternoon interesting was not out of the question either. None of those explanations were confirmed, none of them were disproven. The room moved on to the next paper, and the specimen that could have settled the question one way or the other was not preserved in any collection that exists today. That absence is worth sitting with, because it is not how the period usually handled a find like this one. Fossils of far less apparent significance from that same decade sat in the cabinets of the Geological Society and university collections across Britain for generations afterward, catalogued, labelled, and available for any researcher who wanted a second look. A nail embedded in ancient sandstone, reported by a man of Brewster's standing to the country's leading scientific body, should have ended up behind glass somewhere with a card describing exactly where it came from. Instead, it disappeared from the historical record almost as completely as it had once been sealed inside the stone, and what remains today is only the account of men who saw it once and never got to look again. It is worth being honest about what that absence does and does not prove. A missing specimen is not evidence of anything by itself, and objects have gone missing from far less contested 19th century collections for no reason more sinister than poor record-keeping and a move between buildings. But it does mean the Kingoody nail will never be tested by any method invented since 1844, and that every generation since has been left arguing over a description rather than an object. Geologists who have looked back at the Kingoody account in the years since generally treat it as unresolved rather than debunked, which is its own kind of answer. A claim gets debunked when there is a specimen to test, a photograph to examine, a report detailed enough to check against the known geology of the site. Brewster's account offers none of that. It offers a respected scientist's word that he personally handled a nail he believed had come from inside solid, undisturbed stone, and a room full of contemporaries who apparently found that credible enough to record rather than dismiss outright. Whatever actually happened at that quarry face in 1844, the men who were there treated it as something worth carrying to the country's leading scientific body rather than something to laugh off over dinner, and that alone has kept the case circulating for close to 200 years. What makes the gap sting a little more is how routine preservation was supposed to be by then. The 1840s sat in the middle of a period when British geological societies were actively competing to build the most complete collections in Europe, sending members out to buy, trade, and catalogue anything that might matter later. A specimen tied to a paper read before the association, discussed by name in its published proceedings, should have been exactly the kind of object those collections were built to hold on to. Somewhere between the meeting room and whatever happened to the block afterward, that did not happen, and no later researcher has ever produced a specimen, a sketch, or even a precise description of where the missing stone might have ended up. Two more cases, separated from Kingoody by an ocean and by nearly a century combined, follow close enough to the same shape that dismissing all three as unrelated coincidence starts to take more explaining than taking them seriously does. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In 1891, a woman in Morrisonville, Illinois, named Mrs. S.W. Culp, was breaking up a chunk of coal for her kitchen stove when a piece split away to reveal something inside that had no business being there. Coal breaks along its own grain, unevenly, in chunks shaped by however the ancient plant matter inside it had originally settled, and Mrs. Culp had broken enough of it over the years to know what an ordinary chunk should look like coming apart. This one did not look ordinary. What she was left holding, according to the account printed soon afterward, had a shape too regular and too clearly finished to be anything the coal itself could have produced on its own. Local reporting from that year described what she found as small and clearly shaped by hand, resembling a container more than any natural mineral formation, sitting embedded in coal, mined from a seam already understood at the time to be hundreds of millions of years old, laid down long before anything resembling human hands existed to shape a container out of anything. The story ran in the local paper, was picked up and reprinted elsewhere in the following weeks, and then followed almost exactly the same path the King Goody nail had followed nearly 50 years earlier. Papers in neighbouring towns picked up the account within the same season, most of them reprinting it nearly word for word rather than sending a reporter to look at the object themselves, which was ordinary practice for local news in that period, and part of why so little independent verification exists today beyond the original article. It was reported, discussed, and never deposited anywhere that would let a later researcher hold it, weigh it, or run any modern test against it. What survives of the Morrisonville find today is the newspaper account and nothing else. The object itself is gone, most likely discarded with the rest of an ordinary household's coal scuttle by someone who had no way of knowing, or perhaps no reason to care, that they were throwing out the only physical evidence a strange claim would ever have. 45 years after that, in the mid-1930s, a couple named Max Hahn and his wife were walking along Red Creek near the small town of London, Texas, when they noticed a rock with something rusted and metallic just visible at one edge. Red Creek ran low and rocky that time of year, the kind of ground people walked without paying much attention to individual stones, and the Hahns might easily have passed the same rock a dozen times before something about the exposed edge finally caught the light enough to notice. They picked it up as a curiosity rather than a discovery, the kind of odd stone a family keeps on a shelf without thinking much more about it, and it stayed that way for years. It was only later, when one of their sons split the rock open with a saw, that the full shape of what was inside became clear. A hammerhead, fully formed, fused into stone that had grown up around it, with the remains of a wooden handle still attached, its outer layers turned dark and partly mineralized, while the surrounding rock held the whole tool in place, as completely as if it had been poured around it while still liquid. By the time that cut was made, years had passed since Max Hahn first carried the stone home, long enough that whatever context might have helped date the find precisely, the exact spot along the creek, the exact depth it had rested at, the condition of the ground around it, had already faded from memory the way ordinary details do when nobody realizes at the time that they will matter later. What was left afterward was the object itself and a general sense of where it had come from, which is more than either King Goody or Morrisonville ultimately left behind, but still less than a proper excavation would have preserved. Unlike the nail from King Goody and the object from Morrisonville, the Hahn hammer did not disappear. It survives today, still fused in its stone, on display in a small museum in Glen Rose, Texas, built around exactly this kind of unresolved find, where anyone willing to make the drive can stand in front of the actual specimen rather than a second-hand account of one. That single difference, whether the object survived long enough to be examined again and again, instead of vanishing within a generation of being found, changes what can honestly be said about it. It does not change what it apparently is. Visitors who make the trip today generally find it displayed much the way the Hahn family first kept it at home, presented as a genuine curiosity rather than sealed behind heavy security, close enough to see the grain of the handle and the pitted texture of the metal without any glass distorting the view. Because the hammer survived, it has been cut into, photographed, and examined by more than one geologist in the decades since the Hahn family first found it, and that examination has produced an explanation the King Goody nail and the Morrisonville object were never around long enough to receive. Rock like the nodule that held the hammer can form faster than most people assume when groundwater carrying dissolved minerals moves through a porous bed and precipitates calcium carbonate or iron oxide around whatever solid object happens to be sitting in its path. Under the right conditions, that kind of concretion can close around a tool within decades rather than requiring the kind of geological time the surrounding rock formation might otherwise suggest. Most of the geologists who have studied the piece favor exactly that explanation. An ordinary steel hammer, most likely no older than the 19th century, that ended up in a stream bed and was gradually sealed inside a mineral shell by a process that is well understood and not especially rare. Thin sections cut from the surrounding nodule have been examined under magnification more than once, and the mineral composition matches what that kind of concretion typically produces, rather than pointing toward anything unusual in how it formed. The debate that remains is less about the chemistry, which most researchers who have looked at it consider settled, and more about how quickly that chemistry could have worked, since a faster timeline changes what era of hammer the tool most likely belongs to, without changing the basic fact of an ordinary object trapped inside a natural stone shell. That explanation satisfies most of the people trained to evaluate it, and it has not satisfied everyone else, including plenty of visitors who have stood in front of the hammer in its glass case and walked away no less convinced that an ordinary tool wrapped completely in stone deserves more than a shrug. Both things can be true at once. A natural process can account for how the rock formed around the hammer, and the sight of a man-made object fused seamlessly into solid stone can still be strange enough to stop a person mid-sentence the first time they see it in person, rather than read about it. The stone from King Goody is gone, broken apart or lost sometime in the 1800s by people who had no idea they were holding on to something anyone would still be asking about 2 centuries later. The object from Morrisonville went back into somebody's coal scuttle a few weeks after it made the local paper, and nobody thought to stop it. Only the hammer from Texas is still where anyone can go find it, sealed in the same rock it was found in, waiting behind glass for the next person willing to drive out to Glen Rose and decide for themselves what an ordinary tool, wrapped completely in stone, is supposed to mean. 3 finds, 3 different centuries and coastlines apart, and in every case the pattern lands on the same hinge. Not the metal and not the stone, but the record in between them, kept or lost depending entirely on whether anyone thought to hold on to the evidence before it had the chance to disappear. What separates King Goody and Morrisonville from Texas was never the strangeness of the find. All 3 were, by every account, treated as genuinely strange by the people who first laid hands on them. What separated them was whether anyone with the standing to preserve the evidence happened to be paying attention before it slipped away, and in 2 of the 3 cases, nobody was. King Goody disappeared. Morrisonville disappeared. Texas did not, and that is the only reason anyone can still stand close enough to decide for themselves. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.